The air over Lake Mercer carried a sound only winter could make. A deep, brittle stillness that swallowed everything but the slow creak of ice shifting beneath its own weight. It was February 10th, 2001, when 21-year-old Daniel Cooper and 20-year-old Melissa Reade drove their rust-red Jeep Cherokee up County Road 14 to the state recreation area just outside Mercer, Wisconsin. They were both students at Northern Wisconsin Technical, a small campus that drew kids from logging towns and farming families, the kind of place where the biggest Friday night decision was whether to drive an hour to the bowling alley in Ironwood or drink behind the old sawmill. Daniel and Melissa had been dating for nearly 2 years. He was studying environmental science. She was in nursing, known for her bright laugh and for never turning down an extra shift at the Mercer Health Clinic. That Saturday morning, the thermometer outside the town post office read -6 Fahrenheit, with wind gusts tearing through the evergreens at 20 miles an hour. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. Despite the brutal cold, Daniel insisted that midwinter camping was the only way to experience the North Woods honestly. He'd convinced Melissa to join him for what he called a one-night ice silence detox at the lake cabin his uncle used during summer fishing trips. The plan, according to the journal Melissa's roommate later gave police, was simple. Drive out early, hike across the frozen inlet, spend the night by the wood stove, return Sunday before dark. The last recorded sighting of Daniel and Melissa came from a gas station clerk at 8:23 a.m., where the pair bought 2 thermoses of coffee and a map of the Mercer recreation area. Security footage showed them laughing, Melissa teasing Daniel about his overstuffed hiking pack. At 9:05 a.m., a snowplow driver reported seeing a Jeep matching theirs parked near the service road leading to Lake Mercer's west inlet. After that, they vanished into a landscape defined by white wind and silence. When the pair failed to return by Monday morning, Melissa's roommate, Kayla Jennings, assumed they'd decided to extend their trip. But by Tuesday afternoon, when neither answered calls or showed up for classes, she drove to the sheriff's office in Iron County. Deputy Harold Banks took the initial report, logging it as overdue campers, possible exposure. By dusk, a search team of local volunteers, firefighters, and deputies had set out across the frozen shoreline, guided by snowmobile headlights and the faint glimmer of the moon behind thin clouds. They found the Jeep within an hour, half buried under wind-blown snow, keys in the ignition, battery drained. The doors were locked, and through the frosted windows, searchers saw 2 backpacks, neatly folded blankets, and a grocery bag of unopened canned food. The footprints leading away from the vehicle, 2 distinct sets, tracked across the snow toward the lake's edge. Investigators followed them until the prints stopped abruptly 10 feet from the shoreline where the ice began. There, the trail simply ended, as if the 2 campers had stepped off the face of the earth. The surface of the lake was solid, smooth, and unbroken for half a mile in every direction. No cracks, no holes, no sign of struggle. Deputy Banks marked the spot with a survey flag and radioed for assistance, his breath forming quick, anxious clouds. By midnight, floodlights illuminated the area as deputies drilled test holes through 2 feet of ice, confirming it was thick enough to support a truck. The possibility of both campers falling through simultaneously was mathematically impossible. Yet there were no other footprints leading away, only wind-polished ice stretching to the opposite shore. The initial assumption among investigators was disorientation, whiteout conditions, alcohol, a tragic misstep. But toxicology samples would later prove that neither Daniel nor Melissa had been drinking, and weather records confirmed visibility at the time was nearly 2 miles. The next morning, as divers prepared to cut through the ice for underwater searches, Sheriff Dale Kramer arrived from Hurley to oversee operations. Kramer, a pragmatic man with 28 years on the job, immediately sensed that the scene didn't add up. He ordered aerial photographs, hoping the overhead perspective might reveal subtle depressions or secondary tracks invisible from the ground. The images developed by that evening only deepened the mystery. The snow around the footprint terminus showed no signs of collapse or melting. The ice beneath was pristine, with no discoloration or cracks. The only disturbance came from rescue crews themselves. The official search continued for 8 days, encompassing the entire shoreline and surrounding forest. Helicopters from the state police scanned the frozen surface with infrared cameras. ground teams with cadaver dogs combed the perimeter. Volunteers on snowshoes checked every abandoned hunting cabin within a 10-mile radius. Nothing. Not a glove, not a scarf, not a shred of fabric. It was as though Daniel and Melissa had walked into the lake and been erased. Sheriff Kramer held a press conference on February 19th at the Mercer Volunteer Fire Hall. Local reporters from the Iron County Gazette and the Ashland Chronicle filled the folding chairs, along with nearly half the town. Behind him, enlarged photographs of the lake, the footprints, and the jeep hung on corkboards. "At this time," Kramer said, voice steady but eyes hollow, "we are treating the disappearance as a missing persons investigation with suspicious circumstances." When asked if foul play was suspected, he hesitated before answering. "We don't rule anything out." Theories spread through Mercer faster than the cold. Some said Daniel had planned to propose to Melissa and the two had run away together. Others whispered about murder-suicide, even alien abduction. A retired game warden swore he'd seen headlights moving across the lake the night they disappeared, though no tire tracks were ever found. The cabin Daniel had planned to use was eventually located by deputies, its wood stove cold, sleeping bags still rolled, and canned beans stacked neatly on the counter. No one had entered since late summer. The lock was intact. The investigation quickly hit a wall of silence and snow. Without evidence of foul play, there was little the sheriff's department could do beyond maintain the missing persons file and field occasional tips. By spring, as the ice melted and runoff swelled the rivers, volunteers returned for one last search before the thaw made recovery impossible. Again, nothing surfaced. Daniel Cooper and Melissa Reade became another cold entry in Wisconsin's long list of winter disappearances. Over the next 19 years, Lake Mercer would hold its secret beneath layers of ice and legend. Fishermen avoided the West Inlet, saying it gave them headaches or strange interference on their radios. Teenagers dared each other to spend nights there, claiming to hear footsteps crunching on frozen snow when no one was around. For Sheriff Kramer, the case was a wound that never closed. He retired in 2015, his final report concluding simply, "No remains recovered. Circumstances unexplained." The case file collected dust in the Iron County Evidence Archive until February 2020, when a seasonal thaw and a road maintenance crew changed everything. On February 28th, as workers cleared debris from the county drainage culvert along the lake's southern outlet, one of them noticed a tangle of twine lodged against a grate. At first glance, it looked like fishing line, frayed, discolored, almost part of the natural muck that accumulated each spring. But when the worker tugged it free, a small section of synthetic rope came with it, looped into a precise double overhand knot. Attached to the fibers was something stranger still, a smear of blue residue, faint but distinct, the color of institutional detergent used in commercial laundromats. Within hours, the county crime lab had the sample bagged and logged, the first new evidence in the Lake Mercer disappearance in nearly 2 decades. That rope fragment, no longer than a finger, would unravel the truth about what happened to Daniel Cooper and Melissa Reade, and reveal that their disappearance was never an accident of nature, but the calculated work of someone who'd lived among them all along. By the time forensic technicians finished cataloging the rope fragment, the sun had vanished behind a wall of gray clouds rolling in from the northwest. Winter was returning early that year, as if the lake itself refused to stay thawed long enough to reveal its secrets. The Iron County Sheriff's Department reopened the file under case number 01217LM, reassigning it to Detective Mark Halverson, a 43-year-old investigator known for his patience and his obsession with pattern recognition. Halvorsen had spent most of his career untangling small-town crimes that rarely made the papers: stolen snowmobiles, insurance fires, the occasional homicide disguised as a hunting accident. He'd grown up 30 miles south of Mercer, and like everyone else in northern Wisconsin, he knew the legend of the lake that swallowed 2 young lovers. When the call came from the state crime lab about the detergent residue, he drove straight from his office to the evidence locker and stared at the small plastic bag sealed with a blue label. Inside lay the weathered piece of rope that had waited 19 years to be found. The lab results arrived 3 days later. The residue was a phosphate-free industrial detergent manufactured by a Milwaukee company that supplied bulk cleaners to hospitals, nursing homes, and commercial laundries. The rope fibers themselves were nylon poly blend, standard issue for utility work and snowmobile towing, but microscopic analysis showed unusual wear patterns, compressed striations suggesting the rope had been looped through a metal pulley or clamp repeatedly before fraying. Halvorsen cross-checked the knot, double overhand, tied with precision, and recognized it from his years on the sheriff's search and rescue team. It was the kind of knot used by maintenance crews who lowered water pumps, not campers or fishermen. He returned to Lake Mercer the next morning. The air was sharp, 40 degrees, but damp with mist from the thaw. Standing near the southern outlet where the rope had surfaced, he noticed the subtle depression of an old maintenance road, barely visible beneath years of leaf rot and moss. County records confirmed it hadn't been used since the 1980s, when the Department of Natural Resources installed a series of drainage pumps to regulate lake levels during spring melt. Halvorsen followed the overgrown path a quarter-mile until he reached the remnants of a concrete platform and rusted control box. Inside the corroded metal housing, the original pulley system was still intact. Steel cable wrapped around a drum, crusted with lime and mud. He crouched, ran a gloved hand along the edge, and felt something sharp. Nylon fibers fused into the metal by time and pressure. The rope had not washed into the drain. It had been part of this mechanism once, deliberately fastened and later cut. Back at the office, Halvorsen spread old photographs across his desk. The 2001 crime scene images showed the Jeep, the footprints, the lake, but none captured this drainage platform. It wasn't part of the original search grid, because no one had considered the southern outlet relevant. That oversight gnawed at him. He pulled the environmental service logs for 2000 and 2001, searching for maintenance reports on the Mercer pump stations. Only one entry appeared for that winter, a scheduled inspection on February 12th, 2 days before Daniel and Melissa vanished. The technician's name was Raymond Ray Callow, employed by Northwoods Environmental Services, a private contractor working under county bid. According to the log, he'd performed routine winterization on the Mercer outlet pump. The note included his initials, RC, and a check mark indicating completion. Halvorsen contacted the company. A new manager, unfamiliar with records that old, dug through archived payroll files and confirmed that Callow had indeed worked there from 1994 to 2003. When asked for a forwarding address, she hesitated. Ray died in 2005, she said. Car accident outside Park Falls. Single vehicle. Drove off an icy road. Halvorsen's instinct told him to dig deeper. He requested Callow's personnel file, expecting a few timesheets and maybe a tax form. Instead, he found multiple complaints about inappropriate behavior toward female staff, including one incident in 1998, when a temporary worker accused him of stalking her after she ended a brief relationship. No charges were filed, but the complaint was detailed enough to raise eyebrows. The detective spent that evening reading through the original witness statements from 2001. Mrs. Ethel Gorski, who owned the bait shop near the service road, had mentioned seeing a county truck parked by the access gate the weekend Daniel and Melissa disappeared. Investigators at the time dismissed it as unrelated maintenance activity. Now it aligned perfectly with the timeline of Callow's inspection. The next morning, Halvorsen drove to Gorski's nursing home in Park Falls. She was 91, frail, her voice a rasp of memory and breath. But when shown a photograph of the old county truck fleet, she pointed to the faded orange stripe and nodded slowly. That one. I remember the noise. It rattled like something loose inside. Halvorsen checked the county motor pool records. The 1995 GMC utility truck assigned to Callow had been decommissioned in 2004 and sold at auction. He traced the buyer, a scrap dealer near Superior, and discovered that the vehicle's storage compartment had been sold separately as salvage. The dealer still had the logbook. Tucked inside the brittle pages was a maintenance checklist in Callow's handwriting, dated February 9, 2001. Beneath standard notations, fuel, oil. Tire pressure, one line stood out. Tow rope replaced, blue nylon. The detective leaned back, heart thudding. The same week Daniel and Melissa vanished, the pump technician had replaced his utility rope. The fragment found in 2020 was blue nylon. It wasn't proof, but it was the first tangible connection between Callow and the disappearance. Halvorsen requested the state laboratory to compare the rope fibers from the culvert with remnants found in the truck's storage logbook envelope. The forensic report would later confirm a 97% match in polymer composition and dye structure. Meanwhile, Halvorsen began reconstructing Callow's life. Sure, you're subscribed to stay updated on more cases like this. These families deserve to have their stories told. and your support helps ensure these victims are never forgotten. He'd been 42 in 2001, divorced, no children, living alone in a rented trailer 15 miles north of Mercer. Neighbors described him as quiet but odd, the kind of man who talked too long about water pumps and deer season. One former co-worker recalled that Ray always volunteered for weekend maintenance shifts near the lake, even when others complained about the cold. Another remembered his habit of photographing ice formations, saying he liked the geometry of frozen things. When detectives cleared out his trailer after the fatal accident in 2005, they found boxes of tools, scattered Polaroids of lakes and rivers, and several spools of industrial rope. None of it had ever been tested. The boxes had been auctioned off with his belongings. Halverson tracked down the buyer, an antique dealer named Kurt Brann, who specialized in estate lots. Brann told him he'd sold most of the items years ago, but still had a weird metal case that came with the set. In the back room of his shop, beneath shelves of old fishing gear, he produced a dented steel toolbox with a faded Northwoods environmental sticker. Inside lay wrenches, pliers, and a coiled length of blue nylon rope stained dark at one end. The detective sealed it as evidence and sent it for DNA testing. Weeks passed as snow returned to Mercer. Locals resumed talking about the case, old fears surfacing with new fascination. The Iron County Gazette ran a front-page story. Rope discovery may reopen, 2001, Mercer mystery. Television crews arrived, setting up tripods in front of the frozen lake. Sheriff's deputies fielded calls from psychics, amateur sleuths, and relatives of other missing persons who wondered if their own tragedies might somehow connect. Halverson ignored the noise. He was waiting for one thing, the DNA results. They arrived on March 18th. The lab had extracted 2 partial profiles from the rope. One belonged to an unidentified male, consistent with degraded epithelial cells. The second, faint but distinct, matched Melissa Reade's genetic markers pulled from her mother's 2001 reference sample. It wasn't contamination. The chain of custody was clear. 19 years after her disappearance, Melissa's DNA had surfaced on a rope from a maintenance worker's toolbox. Halverson drove to Milwaukee that night to interview Northwoods Environmental's retired supervisor, a man named Thomas Clegg. In a diner off Highway 51, Clegg stirred his coffee and frowned when shown the old photographs. Ray was meticulous about equipment, he said. He'd clean everything with hospital detergent, the same stuff the company used for shop towels. Always said regular soap didn't cut the grease. Halverson asked if anyone ever questioned his behavior around the Mercer site. Clegg hesitated. We got a complaint once. Some campers said a guy in a county jacket was watching them from the tree line at night. I sent Ray to check it out. He came back saying it was teenagers making noise. Now I wonder if I sent him to himself. The next day, divers returned to Lake Mercer for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The ice had thinned to 4 inches, dangerous but manageable with safety rigs. Guided by sonar, they focused on the southern outlet near the drainage platform. 27 minutes into the second dive, one diver radioed up. Found something. Looks like fabric. Within an hour, they recovered a section of nylon backpack strap tangled in silt. Subsequent dredging brought up a rusted carabiner and a small silver earring shaped like a leaf. Melissa's mother identified it instantly from an old photograph. The discovery triggered a full forensic excavation. The team built a temporary dam around the outlet channel and drained the water to expose the lake bed. What they found there, 3 feet beneath packed sediment, was a shallow depression lined with stones. Within it lay fragmented skeletal remains consistent with 2 individuals. Forensic odontologists would later confirm the identities of Daniel Cooper and Melissa Reade. The positioning told a grim story. Both had been bound at the ankles with blue nylon rope, their wrists tied behind them in the same double overhand knots found on the recovered fragment. For 19 years, the lake had concealed their final resting place less than 200 yards from where their footprints ended. The case that had baffled Wisconsin for a generation was suddenly alive again, but the man responsible was long dead, buried in a roadside cemetery outside Park Falls. For most detectives, that would have been the end. A name, a confession by proxy, a file closed. But for Mark Halverson, something didn't fit. The knots, the detergent, the precision of the staging, it felt too deliberate for a lonely maintenance worker acting alone. There was still one question gnawing at him like the sound of shifting ice beneath his boots. Who taught Ray Callow how to hide bodies under a lake without leaving a single crack in the ice? When the medical examiner's report arrived in April 2020, the autopsy confirmed what the scene had already whispered. Both Daniel Cooper and Melissa Reade had died of asphyxiation secondary to ligature binding. There were no gunshot wounds, no blunt force. Trauma, no signs of drowning. Their lungs contained no lake water, only air. That meant they had been dead before they were placed beneath the ice. The estimated time of death matched the night of February 10, 2001, between 9 and 11 p.m., the same window when Mercer's snowstorm reached its peak. Whoever killed them had used that blizzard as both camouflage and clock, knowing no one would venture onto the frozen lake until morning. For the first time in 19 years, the mystery had form, weight, and method. But Detective Mark Halverson wasn't celebrating. The rope, the knots, and the detergent residue suggested technical knowledge beyond a random crime of opportunity. Callow had access, yes, and the psychological profile of someone capable of obsession. But the precision of the concealment, the mechanical lowering of two bodies into a frozen outlet without cracking the surface, hinted at practice. This was an engineered burial. Halvorsen returned to the drainage platform a week after the recovery, determined to reconstruct what had happened. He brought with him the original maintenance diagrams from 1987 when the pump system was installed. The platform, he discovered, was built with a removable grate that opened directly over a vertical shaft connecting to the lakebed channel. With the pulley system engaged, an operator could lower heavy equipment, motors, pumps, even debris, into the water. If the grate were open during winter and someone knew how to time the operation, the ice could be cut, bodies lowered, and the opening refrozen using a heated discharge pipe from the maintenance truck. It would leave the ice unbroken to the naked eye once temperatures dropped again overnight. Halvorsen tested the theory with forensic engineers from Madison. The experiment worked. This meant that on February 10, 2001, Ray Callow had likely used his work truck's portable generator and heat coils to conceal Daniel and Melissa beneath the ice. But why them? There was no record of prior contact. The two students were from Rhinelander, 30 miles away, strangers to Mercer, except for their weekend trip. Halvorsen combed through their phone records, school logs, and witness interviews. Nothing connected them to Callow, or to anyone in the small insular Mercer maintenance community. Then, while reviewing an old interview transcript from 2001, he found an overlooked statement by Daniel's cousin, Ryan Cooper. Ryan had mentioned that Daniel's uncle, the owner of the lake cabin, used to rent it in the summers to a DNR contractor named Ray something. The cabin's rental logs had never been collected. They'd been considered irrelevant. Halvorsen drove to the uncle's property and found the records stored in a rusted filing cabinet. There, under June 1998, was a signed rental agreement. Raymond Callow, 2 weeks, environmental inspection. Paid cash. Callow had stayed in the same cabin where Daniel and Melissa intended to camp 3 years later. Inside the old structure, now abandoned, Halvorsen noticed something strange. The wood stove bore scorch marks not from firewood but from an acetylene torch. Beneath the ash pan, investigators found melted plastic droplets and a flattened strip of blue nylon. The fragments matched the rope used in the murders. The stove had been used as an impromptu forge, likely to cut or seal rope ends. On the cabin wall, behind a layer of peeling paint, crime scene techs discovered faint pencil etchings, measurements, formulas, perhaps test calculations for load-bearing under ice. Whoever wrote them was experimenting, rehearsing. Halvorsen spent nights in his office, staring at the photographs pinned to the corkboard, the footprints that stopped, the rope, the pump diagram, the autopsy. He couldn't shake the feeling that Callow had not acted alone. In the 1998 rental log, 2 signatures appeared faintly beside his, illegible initials, perhaps a witness or second occupant. County regulations required 2 workers for pump inspections. The company's payroll showed another name paired with Callow that year. Earl B. Fenton, maintenance apprentice, hired 1997, resigned abruptly in 2002. Halvorsen found him living in Ashland. 65 now, retired, working part-time at a hardware store. When the detective introduced himself, Fenton's reaction was immediate and visceral. His hands trembled so violently he dropped the screwdriver he'd been holding. In the back office, Fenton denied knowing anything about the Mercer case, claiming he'd left the company before 2001. But when Halverson mentioned the rope and the DNA, the old man's face drained of color. "You think Ray did it, don't you?" he whispered. The detective said yes. "Then you're only half right." Over the next 3 hours, Fenton's story spilled out in pieces, each fragment colder than the last. He described Ray Callow as brilliant with machines and strange with people, obsessed with what he called pressure logic, how ice, weight, and heat could make anything disappear. During the winter of 1998, Callow had shown him a system he'd built beneath the lake's outlet, a hoist rig adapted from old mining blueprints that could raise or lower loads under frozen conditions. "He said it was for removing pump motors," Fenton explained. "But he talked about it like a trick, something that could fool God himself." After 1999, Fenton distanced himself from Callow, unnerved by his late-night experiments and his habit of photographing isolated campers. The last time he saw him, in early 2001, Callow had borrowed a spool of blue nylon rope from the county workshop. When news of the missing couple broke, Fenton recognized the area instantly. He told his wife he thought he'd seen that Jeep parked near the pump road the day before the storm. He never went to police. "You don't understand," he told Halverson, voice cracking. "Ray said he could make anyone disappear if they stood on the ice long enough." Halverson obtained a warrant to search Fenton's property. In a shed behind his house, officers found a locked trunk containing old photographs, schematics, and film negatives. The images, once developed, showed multiple lakes around northern Wisconsin, each marked with grid measurements and red annotations noting ice thickness, melt patterns, and phrases like test weight success and no fracture visible. Several images depicted human silhouettes, blurred figures standing near frozen shorelines, unaware they were being watched. One photograph, labeled Mercer 2000, captured 2 people in winter coats walking near the same west inlet where Daniel and Melissa's footprints would end a year later. Though their faces were obscured, Melissa's mother confirmed the hairstyle and coat matched her daughter's. Fenton insisted he didn't take the pictures. "Ray gave me those after he died," he said. He said they were his art. The revelation reframed everything. Callow's experiments were rehearsals, his engineering curiosity a cover for predation. But what about Fenton's role? He claimed ignorance, yet his possession of those photographs suggested complicity, or at least voyeuristic fascination. The district attorney authorized Fenton's arrest on charges of accessory after the fact and obstruction. During booking, he muttered, "You'll never find the others." Pressed to explain, he shut down completely. The phrase haunted Halverson. The others. He reopened unsolved missing persons cases from the 1990s involving winter disappearances within a 100-mile radius of Mercer. 4 matched a similar pattern. Victims last seen near lakes or rivers during freezing conditions. All declared accidental drownings despite inconsistencies. In each case, maintenance logs listed either Callow or Fenton as performing winter inspections nearby. The detective began to realize that Lake Mercer wasn't unique. It was merely the most visible grave. He compiled the evidence into a 317-page report submitted to the Wisconsin Department of Justice. The document concluded that Callow and Fenton had exploited their environmental maintenance contracts to scout isolated lakes, test concealment methods, and potentially abduct victims under the guise of routine inspection. They chose times of heavy snow when sounds were muffled and visibility low. Callow's mechanical expertise allowed him to manipulate ice structures, while Fenton handled logistics and transportation. Together, they'd turned the Northwoods into a silent hunting ground where water and cold erased everything. The public reaction was instantaneous. News outlets dubbed them the Ice Technicians. Families of missing persons demanded reinvestigations. The Mercer Sheriff's Office became a pilgrimage site for reporters. Yet despite the outcry, no one could be prosecuted for murder. Callow was dead, and Fenton's statements, though damning, lacked direct confession. The only tangible proof rested beneath the frozen water that had both concealed and preserved their crimes. In July 2020, Halverson received a call from the state forensic lab. They had completed advanced luminol and residue testing on the blue nylon rope from Callow's toolbox. Alongside Melissa's DNA, they found traces from 2 additional individuals, both unidentified. The genetic profiles didn't match any known database entries. The lab's director, Dr. Angela Pierce, believed the samples predated the Mercer murders, residual material from earlier victims. That same week, a construction crew repairing culverts near Pike Lake, 60 miles east, discovered skeletal remains wrapped in remnants of blue nylon rope identical to the Mercer sample. Hit the like button if you believe cold cases deserve more attention. For Halverson, the discovery validated Fenton's cryptic warning. The others were real. But it also deepened the horror. Callow's death in 2005 hadn't ended anything. Someone had maintained the pattern. Among the recovered evidence at Pike Lake was a length of rope sealed with the same heat-fused cut marks, but the polymer analysis showed it had been manufactured in 2010, 5 years after Callow's accident. Halverson studied the photos under his desk lamp long after midnight. Either Ray Callow had an apprentice, or someone had decided that his method, the perfect disappearance beneath winter ice, was worth continuing. Outside, snow began to fall again across northern Wisconsin, thin at first, then heavier, erasing the world in quiet white. And on the frozen surface of Lake Mercer, the wind traced lines that looked almost like footprints before smoothing them away. The first real snow of the 2020 winter came early, settling across northern Wisconsin like a shroud. Detective Mark Halverson sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the photographs from Pike Lake until the fluorescent lights above him began to hum. The evidence report lay open beside a half-empty cup of coffee. Rope composition, nylon polyester blend, dyed industrial blue, thermal seal pattern consistent with mechanical cutting device. Manufacture date post-2009. The words circled him like a question he could not quiet. Callow had been dead for 15 years. Fenton was in custody, frail and frightened, swearing that he'd told everything he knew. Yet here was a new victim bound in the same rope, buried beneath another frozen lake using the same engineering precision. At 3:12 a.m., Halverson unlocked the cold case archive and pulled every file involving winter disappearances since 2005. Most were mundane: ice fishing drownings, snowmobile accidents, hikers lost in blizzards, but one report from 2014 caught his eye. Case 14198WL, missing person, Aaron Kiefer, age 24, graduate student, last seen near Pike Lake. The case had been closed as an accidental submersion. The body had never been found. The original investigator was a field deputy named Sergeant Dean Rulson. The name tugged at something in Halverson's memory. He flipped through personnel records until he found it. Rulson had joined the sheriff's office in 1999, assigned to assist with the Lake Mercer search when he was just 22. He'd worked under Sheriff Kramer and had spent weeks cataloging evidence from that first disappearance. Halverson stared at the date of hire, the proximity to Callow's maintenance contract, and felt the edges of a shape begin to form. Rulson had been there at the beginning. He'd seen the investigation stall, watched how confusion and bad weather could erase a crime. And in 2005, after Callow's death, he'd been promoted to lead investigator for the county's Environmental Safety Division, the same unit that oversaw pump inspections. The detective's pen slipped from his hand. By dawn, Halverson was driving north through blowing snow toward Pike Lake. The cabin lights from Rulson's property burned faintly through the trees. He parked 100 yards down the road and walked the rest of the way, boots crunching over ice-crusted gravel. Rulson answered the door in a flannel shirt, gray in his beard, broad-shouldered and calm. "Detective Halverson," he said with mild surprise. "Heard you're the one who finally cracked the Mercer case. Hell of a thing." His voice was steady, polite, the tone of a man with nothing to hide. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine cleaner and burnt coffee. On the mantel above the wood stove hung framed photographs of hunting trips and fishing tournaments. One image froze Halverson's breath. Rulson, at age 23, standing beside Ray Callow, both smiling over a snowmobile. The caption reading "Maintenance Crew, Winters 01. "I didn't know you knew him," Halverson said, pretending casual curiosity. Rulson shrugged. Everybody knew Ray back then. He worked half the county. He poured coffee into 2 mugs, one chipped, one pristine, the gesture automatic. "I was a rookie deputy when those kids went missing. Spent a week out on that lake. Still the strangest thing I ever saw." They talked for an hour about old cases, the weather, the town's decline. Rulson was friendly, cooperative, even offered Halverson access to old search maps stored in his shed. Yet beneath the small talk, the detective felt something off. The way Rulson's eyes flicked toward the window whenever the conversation brushed against Callow. The faint tremor in his right hand when he mentioned the lake taking what it wants. When Halverson left, he walked a slow circle around the property, noting the generator beside the shed. The steel winch bolted to the concrete foundation. The coils of rope hung in neat loops on a pegboard. All blue, all new. The next week, Halverson quietly petitioned the district attorney for a covert warrant authorizing GPS tracking and forensic surveillance on Rulson's property. Officially, the investigation was closed. Publicly, he couldn't name a suspect without evidence, but privately he knew. The pattern hadn't died with Callow. It had evolved, refined by someone who understood both police procedure and the comfort of routine. On December 6th, a blizzard warning hit the region. Halverson's team installed a remote camera facing the service road that led to Pike Lake's maintenance platform. At 11:47 p.m., motion sensors captured headlights. The vehicle was a 2010 county-issued truck registered to Environmental Safety, assigned to Sergeant Dean Rulson. The footage showed him unloading equipment, a portable heater, a generator, and something long and wrapped in a tarp. He moved with methodical ease, disappearing into the snowstorm for nearly 40 minutes before returning empty-handed. The next morning, when Halverson and his team examined the site, they found fresh tire tracks leading to the frozen shoreline and faint drag marks across the snow that ended at the ice, just as they had in 2001. Forensics drilled through 3 inches of new ice. Beneath, embedded in the slush, they found the tarp. Inside lay a mannequin torso weighted with stones, practice material. Taped to its plastic chest was a laminated sheet covered in handwritten notes. Load test satisfactory. Ice refroze within 6 hours. No visible fracture. Rulson wasn't disposing of a body that night. He was rehearsing. The discovery forced Halverson's hand. He couldn't risk alerting Rulson with direct confrontation, not without learning if there were other victims. He spent the next week tracing Rulson's professional history. After 2005, Rulson had taken over environmental inspections for every county lake with drainage outlets. He held unrestricted access to maintenance keys in emergency vehicles. During those 15 years, 6 individuals had vanished within Iron and Vilas counties, all in winter, all near lakes maintained by his division. The official causes ranged from exposure to accidental drowning, but in each case, Rulson had been the responding officer or had supervised the search. The detective built his case quietly, piece by piece. DNA from the Pike Lake rope was submitted for familial matching, revealing a partial correlation to one of the 2014 missing, Aaron Kiefer. Fiber comparison placed both sets of rope within the same manufacturing batch distributed to county maintenance in 2010. Purchase orders bore Rulson's authorization signature. The circle was closing. Halverson's opportunity came in January 2021, when an early thaw weakened the ice near Rulson's property. Claiming to inspect flood hazards, Halverson and 2 technicians brought ground-penetrating radar to the shoreline. Beneath 4 feet of ice, the radar returned a dense anomaly. Metallic, box-shaped, roughly the dimensions of a 55-gallon drum. They returned after dark with a warrant and a dive team. What they raised from the lake would end any illusion that Rulson's experiments were theoretical. Inside the drum were 2 sets of human remains, both female, bound with the same rope, wrapped in plastic sheeting marked with county maintenance serial numbers. The dental records matched 2 unsolved cases from 2012 and 2015. The medical examiner determined both victims had died from asphyxiation and chemical burns consistent with exposure to industrial detergent. The same blue residue again. When deputies arrived at Rulson's house at dawn, he was already waiting on the porch, wearing his uniform, hands folded calmly on his knees. "I wondered how long it would take you," he said. His voice was almost gentle. "You've done good work, detective. Better than most." The interrogation lasted 16 hours. At first, Rulson denied everything, claiming the drum had been planted. But as evidence mounted, the receipts, the rope, the camera footage, his composure began to crack. At 2:03 a.m., he asked for coffee, took 1 sip, and began to talk. His confession unfolded not like guilt, but like instruction. He told Halverson that he'd met Callow during the Mercer investigation in 2001. Callow had been fascinated by how the police failed to understand the mechanics of ice. "He used to say cold was the perfect accomplice," Rulson recalled. After Callow's death, curiosity turned into obsession. He'd proven it could be done. No mess, no noise, no trace. "I wanted to see if it could be done better." Over the next decade, he refined Callow's design: thicker rope, faster heat coils, detergent to erase biological traces. Each killing was, in his words, a test of integrity, ice versus conscience. Halvorsen asked why he chose his victims. Rulson looked down at his hands, the same hands that had tied every knot. They were wanderers, he said softly. People who didn't belong. Hikers, campers, drifters. The lake takes what it's given. When the interview ended, Rulson signed a full confession spanning 23 pages. He drew diagrams of the hoist systems, the temperatures needed to reseal ice, and even the chemical ratios of detergent used to dissolve organic residue. He confessed to 9 murders committed between 2006 and 2020, all within the iron range. He described Callow as the pioneer and himself as the custodian of a perfect system. At trial, prosecutors presented the evidence in chronological order, tracing a line of icebound deaths back to the winter of 2001. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every seat. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, there was no cheer, only the stunned silence of a town realizing that for 20 years, the man who'd investigated their disappearances had been the one creating them. Rulson was sentenced to 9 consecutive life terms without parole. During his final statement, he stared at the gallery and said, "The ice keeps its promises. It gave them back so you'd remember what it can do." Afterward, Halvorsen stood on the steps of the courthouse, the snow falling around him in slow, weightless spirals. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but he heard only the sound of the wind over the frozen lake miles away. He thought about Callow's notebook, Fenton's trembling hands, Rulson's calm voice describing perfection. For 2 decades, Lake Mercer had been a mirror of the human need to hide what we fear most. Not monsters, but the quiet ingenuity of men convinced they could outthink nature. In the spring thaw of 2021, when the ice finally broke, divers returned to the Mercer outlet one last time. Beneath the silt, they found a rusted toolbox, its label worn to a single word: maint. Inside were lengths of rope, neatly coiled, and a note in smeared pencil. If the ice holds, they never leave. Halvorsen closed the lid, sealing it in evidence. The lake rippled gently beside him, dark and endless, reflecting nothing. The weeks after the verdict unfolded like a thaw that refused to fully arrive. Warmth peeling back winter in thin slivers while pockets of hard cold clung to the shaded places where the sun never reached. For the families of Daniel Cooper and Melissa Reade, closure came wrapped in paperwork and bone fragments, in chain of custody forms and stainless steel trays. In a prosecutor's measured voice reading the names of lakes as if announcing stations on a train line that had run far too long. The Iron County Courthouse emptied of camera crews, the headlines drifted south toward bigger stories, and Mercer returned to its ordinary quiet, which now sounded like a lie everyone agreed to tell. Detective Mark Halvorsen spent those days inside the machinery of aftermath. Approvals for additional dives, off-site storage requests, meetings with the Department of Natural Resources and the state's Emergency Management Division about how exactly one turns a lake into a permanent crime scene without condemning a town's whole economy. He answered calls from families whose missing had never been found and whose hope could no longer keep pretending not to be grief. He watched Fenton plead to reduce charges in exchange for a fuller account of Ray Callow's winter rehearsals. The compromise of a man who had not killed with his hands but had lifted the curtain for a killer and then sat in the audience, telling himself the performance was not his. The plea dealt in hours and exhibits and a single required apology he could not articulate without reading from a sheet of paper that trembled the entire time he held it. The state created a task force, because task forces are what states make when the thing that failed was belief. A multi-agency working group on cold weather recoveries, hydrological concealment, and environmental infrastructure security, which is to say, a manual for not letting men like Callow and Rulson build their rituals inside the blind spots of public work. In April, the task force stood on a stage at the university in Ashland and announced new training modules for deputies and dam operators. Language about ice load thresholds and covert access audits threaded together with words like vigilance and accountability, which in practice meant keys would be logged, cameras would be installed, and the old assumption that maintenance was a world of harmless routines would be retired in favor of the harder truth that any system with gaps is a system waiting for a mind like theirs to move in. What remained for Halverson were the human contours of a case that had become a map. Dots on lakes and rivers, lines between purchase orders and patrol logs, tape measures and timestamps. He stood in Melissa's mother's kitchen and listened while she read a letter she had written to a daughter she could no longer call. A letter that began with a mundane apology about never learning to text as fast as Melissa could, and ended with a sentence that would not stop echoing in Halverson's head for months. I forgive you for going to the lake, because you were not wrong to believe the world would be kind that day. He sat with Daniel's uncle on the cabin steps, while the man stared at the water and told a memory of Daniel being 5 and terrified of diving under because he hated the way the lake swallowed sound, and how the uncle had promised him there was nothing down there but weeds and fish and old beer cans. Promises are memories that haven't learned how to be quiet, the uncle said, and Halverson realized that solving the case had not given anyone their future back. It had only taught them a harder grammar for speaking to the past. The state's forensic unit finished cataloging the contents of the drum recovered from Pike Lake and returned to Mercer with a plan for one last excavation at the southern outlet. A sweep using ground-penetrating radar paired with microcores drilled into the sediment in a grid that turned the lake bed into a spreadsheet. Throughout May, small barges dotted the surface, the crews methodical and unsentimental in the ritual of science. Lower, measure, record, repeat. They found what water protects and time erases. Fragments of plastic sheeting labeled with county serials, a single battered snowmobile spark plug, and a corroded clamp whose interface held the ghost of blue dye where nylon had once pressed against metal. It was not, on its own, a story, but it was evidence, and evidence is a language built to be read aloud in rooms where verdicts are made. Back in the courthouse archives, Halverson set about cleaning the file, not just in the literal sense of organizing photographs and transcripts, but in the way a detective learns to close the circle by taking away as many places as possible for doubt to hide. He wrote an addendum explaining the footprint illusion at Lake Mercer, how Callow had positioned Daniel and Melissa at the exact edge of the shoreline snowpack where drift patterns would preserve their approach, while a thin glaze of clear ice, cut and refrozen, would present as unbroken to responders who were trained to see obvious fractures and not invisible repairs. He described the way heat coil arcs feathered the crystalline lattice back together without leaving a clouded seam, provided the temperature differential was controlled and the wind kept below 15 miles an hour. He included photographs from the controlled reenactments, dark, ugly images that would never air on television, because they were not entertaining. They were mechanical. He attached a memo recommending a statewide registry of water control access points and their master key trees, something the county board would initially balk at as expensive and performative until a DNR engineer pointed out that the cost of ignorance was measured in funerals. On a Thursday near the end of June, just as the town was trading flannel for short sleeves and the grocery store had replaced its sled display with coolers of bait and charcoal, the medical examiner called with one last set of identifications. The partials from Pike Lake matched a missing woman from 2012 named Erin Vaughn, and the remains from 2015 matched a nurse named Sofia Delgado who had been reported missing after a night shift in Ironwood. Their families drove to Mercer for the formal notifications, and Halverson found himself once more saying the only sentence a detective ever learns fully: "We found her." The words landed differently each time, relief in one living room, rage in another, a quiet nod in a third that meant thank you, and also please leave us alone, because the task you have set in motion for us cannot be done in front of you. The appeals began because murder cases accumulate them like barnacles, and though the evidence against Rulson was overwhelming, his attorney argued procedural missteps in the warrant that allowed the GPS placement. The state countered with exigency, public interest, a confession that was not coerced but did carry the metallic taste of inevitability. The appellate court upheld the conviction in a decision that read like an instruction manual for how to recognize evil dressed as competence. Fenton, sentenced to a term that would almost certainly outlast him, wrote letters from prison to the families, each one a clumsy architecture of regret in which the subject was always Ray and never Earl. The grammar of a man trying to find a way to describe himself that did not include the word that everyone else used. In July, the county installed a memorial on the bluff above the West Inlet, a simple granite marker engraved with the names of the recovered and the year the ice let them go. People left things there, fishing lures, notes folded to the size of a fingernail, A single blue rope bracelet that a child had unbraided, then rebraided, then unbraided again, the knots learning and unlearning how to hold. When summer turned toward fall, Halvorsen finally allowed himself to stop carrying the case around like an object whose weight he had to prove. He went home at regular hours, learned the names of the vegetables in his refrigerator before they spoiled, sat on his porch and listened to evening settle across the pines. But he also kept one box on his kitchen table. It contained the last unresolved piece of the story, the one thread he could not pull to an end without risking the return of the whole. In that box were the negatives recovered from Fenton's shed, including one set that did not match any known lake. The shoreline in those frames was wrong for northern Wisconsin, rockier, the tree line shorter, the water dark in a way that spoke of depth rather than silt. The lab pegged the coordinates eventually by triangulating the star field in one night shot and comparing the angle of Orion to the latitude band. The lake was real, but it was not in Iron County. It was 80 miles west in Bayfield, a reservoir called Three Pines that had no drainage outlet, no pump system to hide beneath, no maintenance platform to lower anything through. On the back of one print, in Callow's cramped block letters, was written simply, "Test load fails. New method required." Halvorsen stared at that phrase for days, the way one stares at an answer that refuses to explain itself. It meant Callow had tried the burial by ice elsewhere and abandoned it. It meant the method that became perfect at Lake Mercer began with imperfection. It also meant there might be evidence at Three Pines, not bodies but the machinery of practice, rope fibers fused into rocks, metal scars where a winch had once been bolted, the residue of detergent leached into shoreline pebbles that had never been washed clean by a spring flood. He assembled a small team, 2 techs from the state lab, a DNR officer, a deputy who had never learned to say no to him, and drove out to the reservoir on a day when the wind chased ripples in patterns that looked like writing. They found the remains of a crude hoist mount on a granite outcrop, and 2 anchor bolts sunk deep into stone, the threads still bearing traces of blue polymer where rope had been cinched down hard and long. In a crevice nearby, a coil of line hid like a fossil, stiffer than the newer ropes. Its dye faded to a tired gray, but when the lab tested it, they found the same polymer signature, the same heat-fused cut, and in the microscopic valleys of its surface, a residue of detergent identical to the brand Callow favored. With the additive profile that only appeared before 2004, legislation changed phosphate ratios. It was at last an origin point, proof that the method had been rehearsed and refined, that what happened at Mercer was not improvisation but the endpoint of years of thinking about how to make winter cover for a crime. Halvorsen wrote one more report, this one not for a court but for the living, a document the task force would publish and police academies would teach. It detailed the hallmarks of engineered ice concealment and the ways to defeat it. Mandatory audits of access points, chain of custody on heat devices, thermal imaging protocols during winter searches, a simple rule to replace superstition. Any footprints that end at ice are the beginning of a crime scene until proven otherwise. He included a passage he'd stolen from Melissa's mother's letter, with her permission, because some lessons require a voice that does not wear a badge. The world is kind more often than it is not, and that truth must be defended by systems that refuse to invite its opposite. On the first anniversary of the verdict, the town held a quiet gathering at the memorial. The wind off the lake carried the first bite of winter, and people stood with their hands in their coat pockets and their eyes on the water, as if watching for the past to surface. The sheriff spoke briefly, a minister read a psalm, and then there was a silence that held for a long time, broken finally by the sound of Daniel's uncle clearing his throat and saying that he had decided to sell the cabin because he could not keep promising things to the lake he knew it would never give back. Later, when most had left, Halvorsen walked down to the old maintenance road and stood where the pump platform had once been. The county had dismantled it after the trial, concrete chipped to rubble, metal sold off under a new policy that required records for every bolt. The ground was scarred and clean in the same way surgical sites are, the violence of repair hiding beneath a sterility that insists on itself. Snow began to fall, sparse and light, not yet the kind that covers tracks, just the kind that makes them look fragile. He thought of Rulson's final words about the ice keeping its promises, and he realized the statement was not wrong, but incomplete. The lake had kept a promise to secrecy until the moment it was asked to keep a different one, to tell. Water is honest in that way, faithful to the weight it is given. What had changed was not the lake. It was the people who had finally learned how to ask the right question of it. That night, back home, Halverson put the last of the photographs into the archive box and slid it onto the shelf. The kitchen table was empty for the first time in months. He should have felt lighter. Instead, he felt the particular tiredness that follows completion when the thing that held you up by requiring you to hold it is suddenly gone. He washed his coffee mug, turned off the kitchen light, and stood in his doorway listening to the winter air. Somewhere in the distance a plow groaned, metal on asphalt, a human sound against a season that does not care. He closed the door, and on the other side of the glass, the snow began to erase his footprints on the porch step with the same slow patience it once gave to a pair of young lovers on a February morning. And somewhere beyond those erasures stood the final chapter he had not yet written, because stories as large as lakes end only when the water chooses to go still. When he slept, he dreamt of ice not as a surface but as a sentence, and when he woke he knew there was one more place to go, one more promise the water might keep if asked correctly. And he knew who would ask it. By the second winter after the verdict, northern Wisconsin had learned to live with its legend. The sign for Lake Mercer stood beside the highway, repainted but still carrying the faint shadow of the old bullet holes from the years when locals shot at anything that reminded them of fear. Ice fishermen returned, carefully at first, then in greater numbers, drawn by curiosity as much as by walleye. The sheriff's department issued permits with long disclaimers about structural ice safety, and teenagers told each other ghost stories about footprints that ended in snow. The town's silence had thawed, but beneath it, unease still waited, as steady as the current under the ice. Detective Mark Halverson retired the following spring, 32 years in law enforcement, most of them spent untangling the ways ordinary people could turn winter into a weapon. His badge went into a drawer, but the case never did. He lectured for the DNR task force classes, showing photos of the Mercer site, teaching young officers how not to be fooled by perfect snow. He always ended the presentation with the same sentence: "The moment you believe you understand the ice, it teaches you something new." Then, in February 2023, the teaching stopped being theoretical. A call came from Bayfield County. A fisherman on Three Pines Reservoir had pulled up something that wasn't fish. A fragment of blue nylon rope, heat-fused at both ends. Halverson drove north again, the way an old soldier walks back to the battlefield after everyone else has gone home. He wasn't on payroll. He told the sheriff he was there as a consultant. The young deputies let him. They'd read the reports. Half myth now, the Mercer detective who spoke the lake's language. Three Pines was smaller than Mercer but deeper, a bowl cut into granite where the forest leaned close enough to whisper. The ice was thick, clear, and old. Beneath it, sonar showed a narrow cavity near the reservoir's western arm, something metallic reflecting a shape too deliberate to be stone. The dive team lowered cameras and saw the outline of a rectangular frame, corroded steel bars fused into rock. One diver swore he saw a shadow move, but when they adjusted the lights, there was only silt curling like smoke. By dawn they had raised a steel crate, rusted but intact, the size of a filing cabinet. On its side, barely legible through algae, the stenciled letters read DNR Maint Div A97. Inside lay a toolbox wrapped in plastic, and inside that, an envelope sealed in wax. The paper was brittle, but the handwriting was unmistakable, RC. To whomever the water chooses to return this to, you cannot hide perfection from curiosity. The first test failed because I trusted the ice more than men. Someone else will finish what I began, and when he does, remember, what is buried is not gone. It is only waiting for the thaw. The note was dated January 2000, 13 months before Daniel Cooper and Melissa Reade vanished. Forensic analysis confirmed Callow's signature. The ink contained detergent residue identical to that found on the Mercer ropes. The implication was terrible. Callow had left a message knowing that discovery was inevitable, almost as if he wanted an heir. When Halverson reread the words, "Someone else will finish what I began," he thought of Fenton's frightened muttering about the others, and Rulson's confession describing himself as a custodian. What if there had been more than one custodian? He spent weeks combing through maintenance rosters from the late 1990s. Most names were harmless, retired, or dead. One, however, stood out. Patrick Rulson, Dean's cousin, a contractor for the same division until 2003, who later moved to Minnesota and disappeared from employment records. When Halverson contacted the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, they found a series of unsolved drownings near frozen quarries, bodies never recovered, the same detergent traces found in the sediment. It was possible the legacy hadn't ended. It had simply migrated west, evolving like a species that adapts to new water. The Bureau formed an interstate task force. Halverson came along as the reluctant prophet. He stood beside younger detectives who had grown up watching documentaries about his case, explaining. Again, the physics of deception, the way temperature differentials could heal ice, the mathematics of pressure when a body was lowered and the surface resealed. They searched quarry after quarry through late 2023, finding nothing but the occasional rusted winch or coil of blue rope. Then, in December, sonar at St. Agnes Pit located another drum. The pattern repeated itself. A body, the same knots, the same brand of detergent. But this time, embedded in the plastic was a thumb drive sealed in epoxy. When the text decrypted it, the file contained digital schematics, CAD drawings of improved hoist systems, timestamps from 2018, and a scanned document titled Continuity Protocol R. Inside were typed instructions. A manifesto blending engineering notes with a theology of concealment. The author wrote of purity through submersion, of removing noise from the human experiment. The signature block read DR. It wasn't Dean. He was already serving 9 life sentences. The metadata traced back to an anonymous account created at a library in Duluth, 3 months before Dean's arrest. Someone had copied his files before the police ever found them. The investigation widened into a storm of speculation. Online forums declared the existence of a cult. The press coined the term the frozen line, and self-appointed experts dissected the crimes as if they were puzzles rather than lives. Halverson despised it, the transformation of tragedy into entertainment. But he also understood that the story had become bigger than any one detective's control. Stories that terrifyingly efficient always outlive their creators. In March 2024, an anonymous package arrived at the sheriff's office in Mercer. Inside were photographs printed on cheap glossy paper, recent high resolution, taken at night. Each showed a lake Halverson recognized from the old maps, the first sites Callow had tested. And in the corner of every frame, reflected in the ice, the faint glow of a blue LED indicator, the kind used on modern industrial heaters. On the back of the final photo, scrawled in graphite, "The thaw begins again." The sheriff wanted to alert the media. Halverson told her not to. "If it's real, he wants an audience," he said. "Don't give him one." They formed quiet patrols, infrared sweeps, unmarked observation stations at every site pictured. For weeks, nothing happened. Then, on the night of April 9th, motion sensors at Three Pines triggered again. A figure in heavy winter gear moved across the ice, dragging equipment toward the old outflow where Callow's rig had once been bolted. Before the deputies could move in, the man knelt, set a small black device on the ice, and vanished into the tree line. The device turned out to be a drone camera programmed to record a fixed point, the surface of the lake. When analysts retrieved the footage, the first minute showed only snowfall. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., the ice buckled inward with a dull, concussive sigh, as though air were being released from beneath. Steam rose briefly, and the camera cut off. Divers found no explosives, no body, no signs of tampering. Just a circular depression where the ice had collapsed, and at its center, a single red coat button frozen in place. No one ever came forward to claim responsibility. The forensics couldn't tie the button to any missing person. It became one more artifact in a chain of meaning that stretched from 2000 to the present, a punctuation mark in an unfinished sentence. Halverson retired for good that summer. He sold his house in Mercer and moved south to a town where winter was shorter, but the silence was the same. On his last night before leaving, he stopped by the memorial. The lake lay flat and dark, the sky filled with a thin band of green aurora. He left a note under the granite marker. It read, "No one owns the ice now. Remember the ones who waited for spring." He never returned. Every February since, locals say the lake sounds different on the night of the 14th. The date Sarah Chen vanished in Michigan, the date Mercer remembers. They claim the ice sighs, a long, slow exhalation that runs from one shore to the other, and sometimes, if the wind is right, you can hear a faint creak that sounds almost like rope tightening, followed by silence. Maybe it's the current shifting under pressure. Maybe it's memory, carrying weight. Or maybe it's the water keeping its final promise, to never let anyone believe the surface is all there is.